Collega hoogleraren, geachte aanwezigen. Gaarne heet ik u van harte welkom in deze openbare zitting van de Senaat van de Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. Vanmiddag wonen wij de oratie bij van Dr. S.M.W. Phlippen. Vanwege de Nederlandse Vereniging van Banken benoemd tot hoogleraar in de faculteit Economie en Bedrijfskunde. En wel met de leeropdracht Duurzaam bankieren. Een oratie is de reden waarmee een nieuwe hoogleraar zijn of haar ambt officieel aanvaardt. Het is de gewoonte dat de oratie wordt voorafgegaan door een korte laudatio, waarin een daartoe uitgenodigde collega van de nieuwe hoogleraar de orator introduceert. Dat wil zeggen, ons iets vertelt over diens leven en loopbaan. Voor de introductie van collega Phlippen geef ik graag het woord aan Dr. B.P. de Bruin, hoogleraar in de faculteit Economie en Bedrijfskunde met de leeropdracht Financiële Ethiek. En ik verzoek collega Phlippen aansluitend haar oratie te houden.
Members of the board of the university, distinguished guests, dear Sandra. It is a great pleasure and honor to address you today and to present a laudatio. A laudatio is a short public speech in praise of a new professor giving an inaugural address, typically including a biographical sketch. After graduating from high school in Heerlen, Sandra moves from Limburg to Rotterdam to study Japanese economics, to which not much later she adds sociology. She spent some time in Tokyo to carry out research for her Japanese economics degree and graduates in economics and sociology just a few years into the new millennium. Her background and research experience put Sandra in an excellent position to start as a PhD in the Tinbergen Institute, where she pursues a degree in economics on the topic of pharmaceutical innovation strategies. She graduates in November 2008 with a PhD thesis entitled Come Closer and Co-Create. As you may gather from the title, with its beautiful alliteration, the thesis stands out for its unusually crisp writing style. It's also remarkable because of the entity to whom the thesis is dedicated. It is dedicated not to a person, it is dedicated to a city, the city of Rotterdam. There's only one city that can trump that city. After graduation, an academic career lies in front of Sandra, but her interests and talents are broader than that. And in the years to come, academic work will be paired with lots of other activities. After a few years as an assistant professor in Rotterdam, Sandra becomes editor-in-chief of a Dutch economic policy journal. She writes about poisonous gifts, in Dutch, giftige giften, casting doubt on the way in which Dutch veterinarians manage conflicts of interest arising out of the gifts that they receive from pharmaceutical companies. She writes about a social jet lag, investigating the economic effects of the differences between morning and evening people. And she conducts interviews with such economists as Carmen Reinhardt, Robert Schiller, and Larry Summers. A personal highlight, I find Sandra's reproaching Guardian journalist Joris Luijendijk for his ill-informed and inconsistent attacks on economics. It is clear that Sandra writes like few economists can write, and it is no surprise then that in 2016 she joins the second largest Dutch daily newspaper as chief economics editor. It is part of a job to reflect on economics topics of general interest in a weekly column entitled Phlippens Week. In these columns we learn about the challenges of selecting a high school for one's children and what that reveals about inequality in Dutch education, and also about how to resist one's children's persuasive techniques when shopping for a new pair of shoes. But it is in these columns too that we witness Sandra's increased interest in sustainability topics such as climate change. In 2018, Sandra leaves the newspaper and joins ABN AMRO Bank's economics group, 2 years later becoming chief economist. Among her topics is climate economics. Sandra participates in the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, a United Nations initiative, and this experience convinces her how important the financial sector's contributions are to mitigating and adapting to climate change. At the bank, she convenes a new team in her research group specializing in climate finance. Under her leadership, this team develops methods to measure carbon dioxide emissions of small and medium-sized enterprises built on an intriguing approach using financial transaction data. Sandra has established a position in the Netherlands as an independent thinker. She reaches out to audiences that widely differ across political and socio-economic lines. She does that in a way that convincingly shows that she really cares about the social issues that she talks and writes about, not only in the abstract, not only as an academic, but also in the concrete, as a Dutch citizen and as a human being. Sandra, we at the Faculty of Economics and Business are happy and honored to have you in our group. Welcome to Groningen.
Pathways to climate resilience. In the next 40 minutes, I would like to take you along in 5 pathways to climate resilience. Some are global, some are local. Some about physical landscaping, some about redirecting global capital flows. And finally, there is the European way, a pathway that is about to reveal its success in being the first region to have a realistic shot at dealing with the tragedy of the horizon. But before going into content, I would like to take the opportunity to briefly explain how I see my role in this chair, which is a professorship of practice. In the coming years, I intend to build out on 3 pillars. The first is about translating knowledge from science to practice, about what works and what doesn't work when reducing emissions in households and firms. I will bring these insights that I gather into the banking sector and into the public domain. And this inauguration is an example of that. My second objective is to contribute scientifically in the fields of climate impact assessment, decarbonization, and financial resilience of individuals. In that latter field, I have been working already in the past few years on the question of financial resilience and well-being from occupational transfers, with co-authors that are now watching from elsewhere in the world. More recently, I have embarked on an exciting new study with colleagues from Groningen and ABN AMRO into financial advice and coaching, be it human by humans or in a digital way, and the effect that it has on people's ability to build financial buffers and become resilient to weather the storms that are ahead of us. The third pillar is about opening up financial transaction data for scientific research. These data have the potential to study financial behavior in response to shocks at macro and micro levels. For example, a shock from finding a job, losing a job, from a stimulus payment by the government, from being confronted by a pandemic-induced lockdown, from being flooded. Public policies to keep people financially resilient can benefit enormously if we find a safe way to open up these transaction data. Safe means that the strictest privacy and ethical standards need to be adhered to. Pathways to climate resilience. Climate change does not only pose the biggest human challenge of our time, it is also the largest economic challenge that we know of. So why is that? If we keep our global economy running as we do today, climate change is estimated to lower global GDP by around 20% in 2100. Avoiding climate change by making the transition costs the global economy around 1.5% of GDP. A clear business case, one would say. Although it is not about gaining more, it is about losing less. The impact assessment by the network of central banks hides so the impact assessment of these 20% versus 1.5% loss of GDP, that hides massive regional variation. In fact, countries close to the equator, such as parts of Africa, India, South America, are likely to become uninhabitable from heat. As people will adapt and migrate, less affected economies, such as in Europe, North America, may need to absorb these large migration flows, leading to democratic instability and even potential war. And all of that is not modeled in those climate economic macro scenarios about impact. There is, however, also an upside to this regional variation. In developed economies, where capital markets are functioning well and government debt is still providing room to maneuver, we see that successful emission reduction is taking place while economies keep growing. The Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, France, all examples of success in decoupling emissions from economic growth. Is it enough? Unfortunately not. In fact, if we look back at our efforts since the year 2000, matters have gotten worse. In the year 2000, the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above industrial levels was 45 years ago. We had 45 years' time. Today, this same 1.5 degree target is only 9 years away. But 2024 even started off worse. According to the Copernicus Institute's estimations, the remaining carbon budget for a 50% likelihood to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees has reduced to only 275 gigatons of carbon dioxide starting in January 2024. It means that at this speed, there are only 7 years left to get emissions to zero. Now, this looks very depressing, but we are also speeding up the transition. This is only visible in the margin, where clean energies are growing rapidly. The cost of clean energy and energy storage is declining dramatically, which in turn triggers positive tipping points in other sectors. You may, for example, have heard the news this morning that the use of renewable energy in the Netherlands has increased by more than 500% since 2000. What is still hampering the transition are, roughly speaking, two things: oil and the global warming we already have today. First, oil. If we want to stand a chance to limit global warming, oil investments need to go down. We will need oil for a long time to come, but the point is, we will not need all oil. According to the International Energy Agency, a net zero scenario where we make the 1.5 degree world requires global oil production to fall from 95 million barrels today to 23 million barrels in 2050. But what is more is that OPEC, with a cost price of its production that is only a fraction of that of its competitors outside OPEC, they will grow its market share of those barrels left in 2050 from 36% to 53% in 2040. What that means is that the non-OPEC oil majors will have to shrink their supply even faster, namely from 61 million barrels today to only 11 million barrels in 2050. If you look at today's capital markets, they are nowhere near pricing this risk. And this means that they are either missing the point or they don't believe this scenario to be realistic. The second part is nature. Nature is slowing the transition of global warming. The second part that is slowing the transition is the global warming that is already out there. Nature's ability to absorb emissions from the atmosphere is declining rapidly, as warmer oceans can no longer hold as much carbon as before. And it means that we are kind of trying to grab a carrot that keeps moving further away from us. So why don't we move faster? Why not steepen the transition path? Economists figured out a long time ago that there are two hurdles standing in the way of what seems the most sensible thing to do. One is the tragedy of the horizon. We live now. Our children that are born now will see 2100, but they feel that today's life is too good to change. If our grandchildren would cast themselves back in time today, they would not doubt for a second to introduce a global carbon tax that will efficiently remove carbon dioxide from our economies, while governments receive revenues from that tax that they can make available to help the people make the transition. The fact that they cannot cast themselves back in time is the tragedy of the horizon. There is another tragedy, which is called by economists the tragedy of the commons. My efforts to decarbonize are costly, but although the benefits eventually do exceed the costs, these benefits never reach me unless everyone else does the same thing. So global warming is a consequence of greenhouse gas that has ever been emitted into the atmosphere and that has not been absorbed by trees, oceans, or other carbon sinkholes. This is the tragedy of the commons that prevents action today. Now, despite all that doom and gloom, there are things to be done, and there are also reasons for hope. Doing nothing generates the worst outcome, as we have seen, and so I like to focus on the pathways that get us to climate resilience. And I want to start with the ultimate pathway, if everything else fails. Ultimately, if we act rationally, a big if, there will come a moment of global action. Why? Well, because eventually in almost every country, the benefits of slowing down climate change will exceed the cost of the transition. That means that it will become in the narrow self-interest of each country's citizens to vote in favor of a global carbon tax that pay for its own transition and thereby avoid a much graver loss. Together, these countries will each in their own point in time say, yes, I vote in favor of a global carbon tax if everyone else does it too. And this conditional vote will reach a majority at some point, and then ultimately we will be able to act fast. Global capital flows will start to adjust immediately. Now, this is an ultimate pathway because it may come very late and for many people way too late. There's one thing that scientists can and should do now as a backstop for this scenario. They should make sure that the public and therewith politicians are made aware every single year what that not voting for a conditional carbon tax is costing society. So, for example, in the Netherlands, it means the damage from the Limburg flood multiplied by the higher probability of such a flood due to climate change, and the cost of additional river and sea barrier protection, and the cost of additional foundation to repair the damage underneath 1 million Dutch homes. Adding all these costs is the cost of not having a global carbon tax. And we should compare that cost to the cost from a global carbon tax for Dutch producers and eventually consumers. It is not easy, but it's also not that hard, because all the ingredients are there. On one such ingredient, the financial damage from the Limburg flood, there is a study that I am currently working on. Together with my co-authors from the TU Delft, London School of Economics, and Group Economics at ABN AMRO, we study how financial damage evolves after being flooded. We compare anonymized flooded bank account holders, the orange line, with a control group of non-flooded account holders with similar transaction patterns, the blue line. Now, the additional spending effect of this provides a novel way to identify damage from additional spending beyond what is typically measured, namely what is physically broken in real estate or what is insured. It captures, for example, things like the fact that after being flooded, people buy less groceries because their kitchen is flooded. They can't cook at home. They might spend more on eating out, for example. All this is visible. Now, going back to the global picture. Climate resilience is, in the end, about dealing with both the economic damage from physical climate change, but at the same time, it is also about making the transition, particularly in Europe, where we may need to prepare to become a green European island in a rather brown global sea, at least for the next decades. So what does that entail? First, on transition. So what is a transition? Governments start in transition by introducing a carbon tax and regulations that phase out fossil fuels and provide subsidies for the investments firms need to do so, and households. So reducing the emissions from our production process, very simply put, comes down to 4 steps. First, efficiency. So we produce as before, but with as little as possible energy use. The second is we electrify whatever is electrifiable. Heat, steam, everything that moves. Most of these processes can become electric. Third, we add a renewable energy source like solar, wind, in combination with energy storage to make that electricity carbon neutral. And fourth, the remaining carbon dioxide can also be captured and then stored or reused. Now, if we don't do all of that in the next 7 years effectively, it means that we will also need to start sucking greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere that we have been putting in before, by planting trees or with technical or chemical solutions such as direct air capture or carbon sequestration. Now, because this is quite complicated, I want to give an example. Let's look at a bakery. A carbon tax makes gas to heat an oven expensive. This will increase the price of bread and chase customers away. But the baker around the corner decides to invest in an electric oven and connect that electricity to solar power. It reduces its operational costs and eventually lower the price of bread. Customers will stand in line. Climate change is also about adaptation. So what is adaptation about? Adaptation consists of three parts. Prevention, so we need to invest in ways to prevent gradual warming or natural disasters like flooding to damage our society. For example, by building a dike. Second is reducing the vulnerability, as not all disasters can be prevented by, for example, barriers. Making sure that people and valuable assets start to relocate to safe places is also a part of adaptation. And finally, 3, recovery and resilience. As even the 2 steps above cannot always prevent that people and assets do get damaged, it is important to invest in financial resilience and recovery potential. Now, to make matters more complex, every location's problem is a different set of those adaptation and transition challenges. In regions where policies are stricter, Europe, transition risks for firms and households, and therewith for banks, are larger. Dealing with these risks in Europe requires investments of around 620 billion euros each year on top of current investments until 2030. In terms of adaptation, local weather changes, soil conditions, the depth of the land, the vulnerability of the local economic activity in some location, together that all determines what needs to happen in terms of adaptation. An example to make this a little bit more concrete is a pathway that is very local. The local pathway to resilience for Dutch homeowners. A recent study that I did with the other economists from large banks shows climate and transition risks affect Dutch homeowners. Living in a house with a low energy label, investments up to 30 to even 50,000 euros are required to make it energy neutral. Investigating whether a foundation is still qualitatively all right, and if not, repairing that is costly. Renewing a foundation costs on average 60,000 euros. Preparing your home for extreme heat, heavy rainfall, by greening the buildings, using local vegetation that prevents biodiversity loss, that also needs to happen. The question is, how do these investments and impacts add up? What does a pathway to climate-resilient living look like for homeowners based on the most likely climate scenario from the IPCC and KNMI today? Well, there are a number of steps to consider. 1, assessing what needs to happen where. We need to make geographical maps that stack various risks and find out what plays where in each location. The second is that as these risks become transparent, they will lead to price changes. Low energy efficiency labels in today's housing market are worth around 10% less than similar homes with a 3-notch higher energy efficiency label. For foundation risk, this is much more difficult because we know the probability of foundation damage in a neighborhood, but without costly research into the actual foundations underneath the soil, it is very difficult to assess what repair is necessary where. This uncertainty generates underpricing in some buildings and overpricing in other buildings. Potential solutions that enable the right pricings of these hard-to-know risks that should be investigated. I am not an insurance expert, so to say this is a little bit dangerous. But what about this idea? What about a foundation insurance that translates into premia, which are communicated when homes are offered for sale, just like other service costs? I realize that foundations are currently uninsured because they are called slow-burning problems rather than sudden events. But as long as buyers and sellers don't know what the quality of the underlying foundation is, it functions like drawing a lot from a pool of known probabilities. With a neighborhood-determined probability, a buyer has to incur future foundation repair costs. Therefore, a neighborhood-determined insurance premium that is clearly communicated before buying a home, it would smooth the costs evenly across current and future residents of that neighborhood. Now, if that doesn't work, an alternative is an obligatory foundation valuation when homes are being put out for sale. In whichever way the future costs become apparent, house prices will start adjusting. And that brings us to part 3, because when values adjust, current homeowners may sell their home for less than they had anticipated. With the large value increases of the past years in mind, combined with the relatively low loan-to-value ratio of Dutch homes today, it's around 65% of a house value is a loan, this is not really expected to cause financial problems for most people. But for buyers, it does mean that they can use the price deduction to save up for future or current repair or investment costs. Banks should consider future repair costs that are uninsured for as new risks to their clients' future payment capacity. It would mean that climate risks and transition risks become an integral part of a bank's assessment of whether a client and a building are a good match. This measure prevents vulnerable households buying property in vulnerable climate neighborhoods. You may wonder now, so where are these households supposed to live then? This is our 4th suggestion. We recommend that the government should consider reserving climate-resilient locations excuse me, for low to middle-income homeowners, as these locations become more expensive to live. Wealthy homeowners will crowd out less wealthy homeowners in climate-resilient locations, unless the government intervenes. A phenomenon that is visible today in the US and also in the UK. For most homeowners, dealing with these future risks and recovering from damage is affordable, and only a fraction of total home value. Averages can, however, be very dangerous, as become clear from this picture. Because when considering the stacking of climate risks on top of financial vulnerability of homeowners, excuse me, I'm very sorry. Does anybody have a candy? Yes, you do? Oh, this is my husband. For most homeowners, don't worry. For most homeowners, dealing with these future risks and recovering from damage is affordable and only a fraction of total home value. But as I said, averages can be dangerous, as becomes clear when looking at this map, when we stack the climate risks on top of financial vulnerability of homeowners and also low-value buildings. The Netherlands, which has 3,000 neighborhoods, have 90 Dutch neighborhoods where transition cost and also physical repair costs are both likely to be large, while buildings are of relatively low value and homeowners' income is relatively low. Policymakers clearly need to address these locations with priority. Until 2100, climate risks for the Dutch homeowners is impactful, as we have seen, but manageable. And it requires investments, and the required investments are feasible. However, as the Netherlands is inherently a vulnerable country to sea level rise, we need to think further ahead into the future, starting today. So another pathway to climate resilience is also a just-in-case pathway post-2100. The risks of more extreme scenarios is small, but it is there. As glaciers are melting and ocean water is heating at a speed that surprises climate scientists time and time again. This means that for the Netherlands, we need to start preparing for a just-in-case scenario of much higher sea level rise after 2100. Initiatives such as Permanent Toekomstatelier, NL 2100 and de Breda Nota Ruimte, they are necessary. These multidisciplinary working groups, they think through, they calculate, and they visualize our options for climate resilient living post-2100 in extreme scenarios. The research departments of banks have raised their hands to be involved as well, with scenario and modeling expertise to bring to the table. It may be a good idea to structure and divide the workload, whereby the focus should lie on preventing geographical lock-ins for choices that seem urgent today. Because by 2050, we should aim to have created optionality for these scenarios that are more extreme, as by then we will also know more about where global temperatures are headed. Then there is a fourth pathway. This is the best scenario for climate resilience with a 1.5 degree global warming worldwide. Although that scenario is highly unlikely today, it is still worth to strive for, because every 1/10 of a degree warming that we can prevent provides large amounts of loss prevention. So every euro we spend effectively on preventing global warming achieves more than a euro spent on dealing with the damage. Striving towards a 1.5 degree pathway implies reducing the global carbon budget in 7 years. Or, if we take longer, everything we emit additionally has to be taken out of the atmosphere later. Global finance has the power to make this happen, by steering capital away from fossil activities and by redirecting it to carbon-free economic activities. Of the $130 trillion of capital under management, about 1/4 is referred to as ESG investment, meaning that environmental, social, and governance risks are taken into consideration. Listed firms' ESG scores is the main source of information today for investors and lenders in gauging the environmental impact of their financing. But last year, the economists Figner, Jasper, and Petrie published important work on the actual focus of these ESG-labeled investments. 95% of ESG investments are looking to minimize the impact of climate change and climate policy on their investment. 5% of those investments are about keeping the impact of the investments on the environment within limits. So this raises the question, are ESG-aligned capital flows helping or hurting our pathway to climate resilience? In order to find the answer to this, we need to understand what strategies investors actually deploy when avoiding climate risks affecting their own bottom line. So let's first consider how investors and lenders avoid physical risks. And there are roughly two options to deal with physical climate risks. It is either move out or protect. So move out means that investors shy away from locations where natural disasters are causing most damage. Damage that is not covered by insurance. Last week, the CEO of Lloyd's, the world's largest market for risk trading, said in the Financial Times that unmitigated climate change is already leading to insurance premia in certain regions that only the very wealthy can afford. And he calls for public-private collaboration to keep insurances affordable. In the banking sector, a meta-study by Ralph de Haas shows that global banks tend to divest from areas where natural disasters strike. Local banks, on the other hand, tend to raise deposit rates to be able to increase local mortgage lending in areas that are hit by the disaster. The other option is to protect. So instead of moving capital away from a risk-exposed asset, it is also possible to make investments that prevent risk exposure to these assets. Adaptation investments in, for example, river barriers protect investors' assets behind those barriers. Another example is an investment in nature-based adaptation in local neighborhoods. If greening buildings protects homeowners from heat stress, saves cost of air conditioning, and prevents damage from heavy rainfall, house prices increase relative to areas without such nature-based solutions. While moving capital away from risk-prone areas may help investors stay resilient, it leaves already vulnerable places in the world even more vulnerable as access to capital is reduced. If this moving out is not countered, we will see very large inequalities in an already very unequal world. Investors that protect their assets indirectly via adaptation to protect their assets create more resilience. It is, however, today very hard to convince private investors to choose for this option, because the benefits of those adaptation investments are not exclusive to those that made the investment. So now on to transition risks. How do investors and lenders avoid transition risks? Well, also here, the basic options of moving investments away or staying in and lower the risk also holds true for the way investors avoid transition risks. So that is risks that climate policies affect an investor's bottom line. Transition risks are risks that arise from efforts to phase out fossil fuel from economic activity. Taxes, norms, other forms of regulation can generate those transition risks. Even subsidies or public infrastructure investments can create transition risks, as it can shift the competitive landscape for firms. Once the transition starts, firms and households and the government shift their demand and supply of goods and services, and it is very likely that this does not always go smooth. So imbalances resulting from, for example, electricity grid congestion cause transitional hurdles as well. Shortage of workers in the renewable energy sectors is causing hurdles as well. It's all part of transition risks. So let's look at how investors can deal with this. First, they can move out. So for corporations that use fossil fuels, regulation often implies cost increases that lower a firm's profitability directly or indirectly. Because if firms raise their prices, demand falls. The more strict regulation becomes, firms that are unable to avoid these additional costs will go bankrupt, causing stranded assets for the investor. Now, to prevent this, investors will move out once they are convinced that these assets are going to strand. Alternatively, investors can convince corporations to move their polluting activity to other jurisdictions without regulation. This so-called pollution haven effect does exist, but it is rather small according to empirical evidence. Now, the other option is to stay in. Investing in decarbonization is the strategy that creates most economic and societal resilience. With decarbonization, corporations future-proof their production and they avoid costly regulation. Whether they can compete depends on the relative cost of emitting carbon, depends on whether consumer demand for non-polluting activities moves along, and whether governments shield firms from competition from outside the region where the transition policies are in place. And then there's the option of green opportunities. So investors and lenders can also change the composition of their portfolio and add corporations that have no emissions, but also that offer products and services that enable these other firms to decarbonize. Or they can invest in firms that solve transition hurdles, such as battery technologies that solve demand-supply imbalances for renewable energies. Even firms that solve labor shortages in transition-relevant occupations could be considered to reduce transition risks for investors. Besides the upside revenue potential from firms that solve the transition hurdles, the spillovers of these solutions to the other part of an investor's portfolio is something to take more into account. In jurisdictions with sufficient transition risks, all three of these options are today occurring. Capital is moving out of fossil fuel activities. Corporations are investing in decarbonization, and investments into clean energy is increasing. Especially when emissions are priced under an ETS system, the emission trading scheme, it is clearly very effective. Dutch corporations that have to buy emission rights under this ETS system have reduced their emissions in 2023 by 13%, while almost no bankruptcies occurred. Recent research by Sastry, Verver, and Marquez Ibanez, using the ECB bank lending data, combined with ETS firm-level emission data, shows that European banks are slowly freeing their balance sheet from financed emissions as well. But it is not the commitment to net zero that makes a difference to how successful these balance sheets change. Banks that join the Net Zero Banking Alliance do not divest more from fossil fuel firms. They don't engage more to decarbonize, and they do not lend more to renewable energy projects. This is disappointing, to say the least. And it means that something else is moving the needle. I suspect it is the combination of climate stress testing for banks, with ever stricter regulations from the EU Green Deal, and the carbon border protection mechanism that is moving the needle. But there was one element missing so far, which is data. With the latest regulation, called CSRD, Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, starting voluntary reporting this week. We already see that in the newspapers, that journalists are reporting on all the emissions of large corporations within Europe. Firms are now starting to learn about and report on the environmental impact of their input materials, their production process, and most important, also from the consumption of all the products they sell everywhere in the world. I am very optimistic that this is the last ingredient that Europe required to break the tragedy of the horizon. And so finally, the fifth and last pathway to climate resilience is the European pathway. Europe is making a remarkable turn in history right this moment, a turn that may prove the European answer to breaking the tragedy of the horizon. So what is happening? Well, it is a combination of three channels that are together impacting each other. It starts with the European Commission that kick-started climate policies already in 2005 with the emission trading scheme, that today effectively forces firms representing about half of the emissions to pay an ever-increasing price to emit greenhouse gases. The Paris Agreement made Europe commit to being emission-free, net zero, in 2050. And the Green Deal specified what needs to happen when to get there on time. In effect, Europe created transition risks for those investors and lenders if their clients are unable to make the transition. That is the first pillar. The second pillar is the ECB. The European Central Bank, who is together with a network of global central banks a front runner in assessing the impact of climate change and the transition to net zero on firms and households in Europe. As most firms and households have outstanding loans from European banks, the supervisor is asking these banks to stress themselves to these risks. This means that since then, banks are thinking through what climate change could mean in 2050 in an adverse scenario, while at the same time assuming that indeed emissions get increasingly expensive and risky. This stress testing generates two advantages. One is that more climate-related risks on a bank balance sheet means more capital buffers need to be held against these risks. Reducing these risks also means lower capital buffers apply. And this should become an incentive for banks to reduce emissions from their balance sheet. The second advantage is that banks know what losses they will avoid from investments and loans that keep households and firms resilient. It is the net present value of these future gains in terms of losses that didn't happen, and hence the capital that is freed up to become deployed, that banks need to start banking on. As we saw in the study from SASRI, finance emissions are not reducing fast. That is disappointing, but if it is the weighing of climate risks and not the strategy that moves the needle to sustainable banking, then it is also clear that something crucial has been missing so far to make the shift, and that is data. So the third pillar is data from this firm-level reporting. And since this week, firms start this voluntary and later obligatory reporting. So firms have to find out how the whole product chain in which they are active is affecting the environment. Report on it in a way that fits with the strictest accountant standard that the world knows. And with this third pillar in place, the policy pillar and the banking pillar will become much more granular and therewith effective. You could see this as that the three parts of the European way, they start dancing with each other. Policies can be more proportional and targeted Now that policymakers know who is emitting what, banks can start distinguishing clients that are leaders or laggards in the sector. And this should enable lenders to start introducing environmental risks into individual client credit risk pricing in a way that functions as a shadow carbon price. Central banks can increase capital requirements from emissions, but it also has to allow banks that prove their reduced finance emissions to free up that capital again for more decarbonization finance. Also, adaptation financing through public and private arrangements does start to stand a chance. Investors with an ESG agenda have so far focused on the question what climate change does to their profits. But if the environmental impact reporting of firms is out there in a reliable manner, investors will start to anticipate the policy and the bank lending step up in emission reduction. And with that, the circle is round again, as environmental impact becomes part of an investor's narrow or not so narrow self-interest, and capital flows in Europe should start aligning with a 1.5-degree world. Now, are there risks? Yes. Can this bold European step-up backfire? Well, it might. If the European Parliament decides to roll back on policy stringency in a severe way. In that case, the reporting of transition readiness could become a signal of lower, not higher competitiveness, as firms start to internalize the costly externalities. Investors with their own bottom line to worry about may move in the opposite direction as a result of that, and then all the benefits described will slowly unwind. Then there's also the risk that credit demand moves to non-bank lending, and risks move out of sight. But the European way has taken many years to get to this point where we are this week. And it has 3 very firm pillars now that are not easily destabilized. And once Europe has shown the way, it is not even completely unrealistic that the rest of the world will follow. Ik heb gezegd.